Hello everyone. In this video we'll be talking about the Nintendo Entertainment System, or more specifically its cartridges, and what technology they used, and how some people got around that. I won't be getting into the whole history of the NES or Nintendo in general, but of course I will provide some basic context. In 1983, the once booming American video game console market was in ruin. Retailers and consumers were no longer interested in video games. What caused the video game crash of '83 is relatively complex and is still used as a case study for market analysts to this day. But to simplify, it was caused by an inundation of low-quality software, leading to a high retail return rate, and an overabundance of hardware. In fact, in 1982, there were more than 8 game console platforms actively competing in just North America alone. Meanwhile, in Japan, Nintendo had released the Family Computer, their first true game console, in July of 1983 to immediate success. Nintendo saw an American release on the horizon, but fully aware of the situation, they knew in order to be successful, they needed to innovate. In the wake of the crash of '83, many retailers were hesitant to stock anything related to video game consoles, so the Famicom was redesigned and rebranded in the American market to disassociate with video games. The new name of the console was Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, evoking a feel of AV equipment. The oversized cartridges, or game packs as Nintendo referred to them, were similar in size and design to a video cassette, and loaded into the system, or control deck as Nintendo called it, similarly to high-end VCRs of the time. And one of the system's advertised features was a toy robot of all things. The system specs include a Ricoh 2A03 8-bit CPU clocked at either 1.79 or 1.66 MHz, depending on the region, most likely to more easily sync with the appropriate video signal. This chip is a clone of the ever-popular MOS Technology 6502, used in many other computers and consoles of the time, including the Atari 2600, Atari 8-bit computers, all 8-bit Commodore computers ranging from the PET all the way up to the 128, and the Apple II. The NES also featured a Ricoh-manufactured custom video chip capable of 64 on-screen sprites and 48 colors, as well as 2 kilobytes of base system RAM. These specs put the NES's performance on par with many popular home computers at the time, save for the RAM. The North American launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System occurred in October of 1985 and was an immediate success, single-handedly revitalizing the once ruined console market. But, behind the scenes, things were much different. Whereas anyone with the proper know-how could, in theory, produce and sell an Atari game, without Atari being able to so much as bat an eye, Nintendo, out of fear for the second coming of the video game crash, implemented a highly stringent game licensing program and made some enemies in the process. For a third-party developed game to be certified for distribution, the game would be reviewed thoroughly and would be required to meet Nintendo of America's strict standards. Games were required to be family-friendly and could contain no profanity, violence, sexual content, political symbols or messages, or religious or cultural symbols, or etc. Interestingly, much of these standards were upheld only by Nintendo of America and Europe. Oftentimes, games would be released in Japan unmodified, but would be censored for American and European release. This was a huge indication of Nintendo's paranoia in the Western market. In addition to the content standards, Nintendo also restricted the number of games a company could publish, usually being less than 6 per year, and required the developer to remain exclusive to Nintendo for a set period of time, usually an entire year, and would pocket a sizable royalty from a game's sales. Another way the NES was set apart was how Nintendo would enforce their licensing on a hardware level. In December 1985, Nintendo of Japan filed a patent entitled System for Determining Authenticity of an External Memory Used in an Information Processing Apparatus. The patent outlined a game console containing a matching proprietary chip in both the system unit and ROM cartridge that would communicate to verify the authenticity of the inserted cartridge. This is referred to as the Checking Integrated Circuit, or CIC. In order to fully understand how this works, we need to know how ROM cartridges work. I won't go into full detail, but to put it simply, game cartridges work by making read-only memory, containing game code, available to the system's memory map from which the code will be loaded into the system memory and executed. On the NES, when the console is powered on and the game is loading from cartridge, the CIC chip attempts to verify the cartridge's authenticity. The CIC chip in the system can be easily identified as the only Nintendo-branded IC. All the other chips were made by Ricoh, Toshiba, and Fujitsu. Opening a typical cartridge, you'll immediately notice the PCB is significantly smaller than the actual shell, although later PCBs with save systems and extra functionality were usually larger. The two large chips are the character ROM, containing the graphic characters, and the program ROM, containing this actual game code. The smallest chip is the CIC. In order for the game to start up, the console must find a valid CIC in the cartridge with the same region as the console. The console CIC contains an encoded message that is sent to the cartridge, and the cartridge CIC responds with its encoded message, which for the check to succeed must be identical to the message from the console CIC. If they are indeed the same, the game will boot and function normally. Cartridges from Europe and other regions contain a different CIC code, and thus will not work. When a cart fails the check, the console will power cycle indefinitely, making the game unplayable and creating the infamous blinking red light error. Japanese games do not contain a lockout chip, and are actually narrower due to the added data lines for the CIC on international carts. Although interestingly, Nintendo actually inadvertently produced their own semi-official Japanese cartridge adapter. With certain copies of Nintendo's Gyromite, a title that shipped alongside Rob the Robot, you can find the original Famicom PCB. Notice the top PCB containing the ROM is narrower, and below that is a 60-pin to 72-pin adapter containing the lockout chip. Technical users were able to fashion a proper Famicom adapter out of the board. Unofficial adapters that were sold are essentially exactly the same. As an interesting side note that I discovered while researching this video, in the patent form describing CIC, Nintendo outlined a potential CIC implementation in a floppy disk, presumably for use in the Famicom Disk System hardware add-on. The chip, located in the corner of the disk away from the magnetic media, would connect via mating contacts and pins on the edge of the disk and in the drive. The system was never implemented in the Famicom Disk System or any other product. I suspect the reason came down to cost. The Famicom Disk System was designed to reduce the cost of games, as manufacturers industry-wide were experiencing a chip shortage at the time, so implementing a chip into the disk would defeat the purpose. Initially, the CIC chip was successful in enforcing Nintendo's licensing policy, as the code contained within was protected by copyright, making it illegal to reproduce. But some companies found creative ways to avoid shelling out money to Nintendo of America. One of the most well-known unlicensed publishers in the NES was Tengen, which was a shell company created by Atari to avoid the exclusivity rules, as Atari was still manufacturing consoles and computers at the time that would compete with the NES. The gaming historian produced a video that detailed the history of the company in more comprehensive detail, a link to which will be in this video description. In simplistic terms, Nintendo's strict policies were putting unwanted financial pressure on Tengen's business, so they illegally obtained and reverse-engineered Nintendo CIC and began producing games without license. Nintendo sued over copyright infringement, eventually won, and Tengen's games were removed from the market. Tengen was actually one of the more legitimate manufacturers of unlicensed games, publishing products from reputable manufacturers including Namco, Sega, and Atari. The company produced a total of 20 NES games between 1987 and 1991, and after their little incursion with Nintendo, continued developing games on other platforms until they ceased operations in 1994. The games listed here in green were licensed at release, but later print runs were not. This game is Super Sprint from 1989. It's actually a pretty fun game in my opinion. Looking at the physical cartridge, its size and shape is very different compared to an official one. This is because official cartridges were all produced in-house by Nintendo. The back of the cartridge contains your typical warnings and, rather laughably, the Tengen seal of quality, mimicking the icon seen on officially licensed products. The cartridge actually does feel like it's really well made though, definitely on par with official games. Let's open the cartridge and have a look. Tengen cartridges use T10 Torx screws, one of which is hidden behind the rear label, so I'll gently peel it away and remove the screw. The cartridge PCB actually looks identical to many official carts. Here's the character ROM and program ROM, and these are game-specific supplementary chips, most likely RAM. Finally, the cloned CIC. Codenamed Rabbit, this chip is a full reconstruction of the original chip, and thus is functionally identical. Camerica was a wholesale enterprise founded in 1985 in Ontario that primarily specialized in distributing glassware and pottery. In the early 1990s, Camerica branched into video games on the NES, publishing titles developed by British firm Codemasters, known for producing many popular titles on the Sinclair ZX Spectrum home computer. Camerica, being a small company, was simply unwilling to pay Nintendo for licensing, and began producing games in an unlicensed fashion. Camerica produced said games between 1989 until their bankruptcy in 1993. Camerica cartridges look rather flashy, usually sporting a shiny gold or silver coloring, although in my opinion it feels a lot cheaper than an official cartridge. This game is MiG-29 Soviet Fighter, released in 1989. It's basically just a clone of Afterburner, and not really a good one at that. It also has a scoreboard that gets wiped out every time the game turns off, because there's no save battery in the cartridge. Also, political reference, that'll never get approved. I guess I'll stick with FSX. Camerica, along with the vast majority of unlicensed manufacturers, uses a different method of circumventing the CIC technology. On startup, the cartridge emits an electronic pulse that temporarily freezes the lockout chip, disabling its function. When disassembling the cartridge, you can clearly see the capacitor that generates the charge. One thing specific to Camerica can be seen on the back. Right next to your typical warnings is a cutout in the cartridge revealing a switch on the PCB. The label on the cart describes it in minimal detail. Position B. Use if not working with position A. Position A. From what I can understand, the switch essentially changes the region of the cartridge and allows it to work on a European NES and CIC. I assume the reason behind this was because it allowed Camerica to sell the same cartridge in both regions, especially since they were publishing games developed in Britain. Another Camerica product, and what is probably the highest selling unlicensed peripheral for the NES, is the Game Genie. Designed by Codemasters, released in 1990 and distributed by toy company Galoob in the US, the Game Genie allowed the user to enter codes to cheat and modify games. Its CIC avoidance is very simple. It just passes through the CIC chip from the target game. Camerica's final product was the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, which I do not own. The Deck Enhancer was a product whose goal was to enable games to be produced significantly cheaper. The Deck Enhancer adapted the NES cartridge port to accept smaller and therefore cheaper, compact cartridges. It is also unlicensed and uses the same CIC technology as their other unlicensed cartridges. The Deck Enhancer was released extremely briefly as it came mere months before Camerica's bankruptcy in early 1993. All of the very few of the released Deck Enhancer games were all developed by Codemasters and were available on standalone cartridges. Much like Tengen, Camerica, as well as their US distributor, Galoob, were sued multiple times by Nintendo. One of the more famous cases involved the Game Genie allegedly tampering with copyrighted game code, but somehow Camerica prevailed every time, even once earning $15 million worth in damages from Nintendo. Well, if we're talking about unlicensed games, I would be darned if I didn't talk about Color Dreams. Color Dreams was a small company founded in 1988 and began developing and publishing unlicensed games. Nintendo threatened to blacklist any retailer stocking Color Dreams products,
essentially dooming their business. So, Color Dreams came up with a plan. In 1990, Color Dreams rebranded to Wisdom Tree and began selling Bible-themed games in Christian bookstores, which likely didn't sell video games already. As well, the Bible is literally thousands of years old and therefore copyright neutral, so Color Dreams doesn't have to develop a new IP or pay licensing royalties. These games have become notorious for their universally poor quality and questionable at best implementations of religious messages, which come across as blatant pandering. Nowadays, these games are considered novelty collector's items and are rather rare due to their unconventional method of distribution, hence the reason why I don't own any. However, Wisdom Tree was able to find some success in their niche, and as I discovered during the production of this video, they continue in business to this day, and judging by what I found on their website, they seem to still be selling NES cartridges containing the games they developed back in the 90s. I was actually considering ordering one of these to show off in this video, but eventually decided against it. But if that's something you would want to see in a future video, please leave a comment below. Anyone who has used a Nintendo Entertainment System has experienced this at least once. You insert a cartridge and power on the system only to see a blinking red light, a flashing screen, or corrupted graphics. The root of the problem can be traced to a design flaw in the cartridge loading mechanism. Let's open up the NES and have a look at the loading mechanism. To open it up, we must remove the expansion port cover from the bottom and remove 6 screws. All screws in the NES are Phillips style. Next, we can lift the top cover away. Unscrew 8 screws around the upper RF shield and then remove it. To remove the loading tray, we remove 6 more screws. Slide it forward and lift it out. When reassembling the NES, make sure that the lip on the front of the loading tray slides under the logic board so everything can fit in place. We now need to remove the logic board. Remove the 2 screws near the power and RF modulator ports and lift out the board. Disconnect the power LED and button header and 2 controller port headers. Once the board is out, remove the 180-degree cartridge port from the cartridge edge connector on the logic board. This 72-pin connector is the cause of the problem. When a cartridge is inserted into the port, the pins on the top and bottom of the connector make contact with the cartridge's card edge, making the cartridge readable. However, over time, as the system is used more and more, the pins in the connector begin to bend out of alignment. Eventually, they are bent so far out of the way that their connection to the card edge becomes intermittent or non-functional. As I mentioned, the console will reject a cartridge if it can't detect a CIC chip and hold the system in reset. If there is even the slightest bit of a connection loss in the data lines to the cartridge CIC caused by the faulty pins, the console will continue to power itself indefinitely, hence the blinking light. Many people suggest that a fix for problems loading a game is to simply desolder and remove the CIC chip in the NES. After all, due to it performing its check concurrently with the loading of the game, the chip is not required for the operation of the system. But in my opinion, this isn't a direct solution. Sure, the game will attempt to load every time without any regard to the cartridge legitimacy, but if the cartridge port has the bent pin problem, you still will receive problems such as a white screen or completely scrambled graphics. I suppose one benefit of this method is that you would render your console region-free. However, Japanese games wouldn't work due to the difference in the size of connector. Other people will tell you to boil the cartridge connector in water to attempt to tighten the pins. I haven't tried this myself, but I have serious doubts of its effectiveness. From my experience, a surefire way to rejuvenate your NES is to take out the cartridge connector and use a small hook to gently bend each individual pin upwards. It's worth mentioning the second model of Nintendo, model NES 101 Top Loader, from 1993 doesn't suffer from these issues, although the original is far more desirable due to its composite output, whereas the top loader's only monitor connection method is a muddy RF television signal. Okay, we don't need a separate chapter for that. And stop it with that cheesy sound effect. There is no doubt that the Nintendo Entertainment System was one of the most iconic and important game consoles in history. Undeterred by its flaws, not only did it entertain millions of people the world over, but served to revitalize the gaming market in North America after the crash of '83 and made Nintendo synonymous with video games, despite creating a polarizing stir in the corporate world with their demanding licensing strategy and industry-first lockout technology, both of which would eventually become standard in the new market. Nintendo's censorship eventually went the way of the dodo, so to speak, with the introduction of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, created in 1994, which shifted the responsibility of game content to the consumer and allowed them to be greater informed. Nowadays, although the industry has evolved by leaps and bounds, it will continue to provide entertainment to an ever-growing demographic of people, especially in the new internet age. Like, comment, and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.